Okay, and it is time for Chapter 32 Key Questions, looking at FDR's New Deal. So first, how is FDR different from Hoover and the other 1920s presidents? When FDR takes over, we have had over a decade of laissez-faire government. In other words, they were hands-off. So even as the economy collapsed around them in the end of the 1920s, Hoover and the other Republicans kept their hands off. They did not spend billions of dollars. They did not really attempt to fix anything. So when FDR takes over with his New Deal, he plans to experiment and do whatever it takes to fix the economy, and that included spending billions of dollars. This is also known as Keynesian or deficit economics, where you spend money and go into debt in order to bring profit or recovery on the opposite side. Number two, what were the three R's to Roosevelt's New Deal programs? They are relief, recovery, and reform. Relief would be immediate money or aid sent to people who were desperate and needed it. Recovery would be things like providing jobs or things that would help the economy recover by providing jobs that would provide income, which would then have money spent on the economy. And then reform are things that might fix the issues of corrupt practices in banking or corrupt practices in stocks. And these reforms would be long-term changes that would stop any of those issues from coming up in the future. Number three, what was the purpose of the fireside chat? And what industry did Roosevelt target first? So the purpose of the fireside chat was him to reach out personally to the nation to let them know how things were going. He was going to explain his plans and encourage them or lift their spirits as needed. So he would do this through the radio, and his radio would be, absolute listening that people had to do across the country. Not required, but people wanted to tune in to hear him. So these fireside chats began by Roosevelt explaining to them that he was going to fix the banking industry. As we'll see below with the Glass-Steagall Act and with the FDIC, Roosevelt shuts down the banking industry for a short amount of time called a banking holiday to stop bank runs, and then opens them to restore confidence, as he said, to make sure that people knew that their money would be safer in the bank than under their mattresses. And so these fireside chats sought to encourage and improve people's confidence, what he was doing, and also in the banking industry at the beginning. Number four, how did each of the following men challenge Roosevelt? First, you have Father Coughlin, a very popular radio host who at first was very pro-New Deal, until over time he saw Roosevelt's programs helping those who were already wealthy, specifically the Jews. And so he began his anti-Semitic rants against them, calling it the Jew deal instead. And although he lost favor, he was a very popular opponent of FDR throughout his presidency. Then you have Dr. Francis Townsend. This man was less of a man challenging Roosevelt, more of a guy throwing out some ideas that would later be adopted. He believed that what we needed to do is encourage older people to retire to open up jobs for younger people. By providing money for them and income, they could retire and ride off into the sunset with their issues taken care of, and allow more people to get jobs. And so his plan, although it wouldn't be considered a direct challenge to Roosevelt himself, would later become part of the Social Security Act. Then you have Senator Huey Long. He was from Louisiana, and he pushed for basically the division of income, or redistribution rather, from the wealthy to everyone else in the country. And thousands of dollars would be distributed across the country, taken from the millionaires at the top of the economy. This would be considered, well, quite frankly, communism. And so he was considered a very dangerous and radical solution to America's issues. Before he could get too much power, however, to challenge Roosevelt for his presidency in 1936, he is shot and killed. So these three men have three different ideas and different types of challenges to Roosevelt, but they nonetheless are popular figures with popular ideas. Number five, the following items and acts, laws, acts, or programs passed during Roosevelt's New Deal. For each item, identify its purpose, what it did, and the group each act helped. So first we had the Glass-Steagall Act. What it targeted was trying to fix the banking industry or reform it. It divided the banking industry into commercial and investment banking. The purpose of this was to try its best to stop future corruption, where people would take their money from the banks and they would take your savings and invest it in the stock market. So this enabled us as consumers to be able to put our money in a bank that we trusted to use for the purpose we gave it to. And investment banks could then also continue doing what they did, which was gamble and invest in stocks, potentially making money, but if they lose it, you're not hurting people who didn't want their money in the stocks to begin with. So again, this is very much a reform bill meant to fix the banking industry. Second, we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. Its purpose was to help young men ages 18 to 25 to get jobs. So what they did is they would bring these young men out into places like the Great Plains, where they built the shelter belt to protect it from the horrible winds that destroyed the Great Plains and turned it into the Dust Bowl. This is just one of the many different jobs that CCC did. By giving these young men jobs, they provided income to them, and their money actually went back to their families rather than staying with them. And so money thus would be provided for lots of different people, and also keeping young people busy and employed, which was very difficult during the Great Depression. Next, we have the National Recovery Administration. So this NRA, its purpose was to manage businesses and the workplace all across our country. The issue is that it was simply too powerful. It tried to manage things like minimum wages and collective bargaining and manage all different things down to the very small businesses. So because this bill is found illegal, or rather unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, the NRA is eventually undone, and you'll see it divided into the Wagner Act and Fair Labor Standards Act below. But so the NRA tried to fix a lot of the labor issues we'd faced in the 20s and early 30s, and unfortunately was found unconstitutional. Next, you have the TVA. The purpose of the TVA is threefold. It actually meets all three of the R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Because the TVA provided jobs, provided short-term benefits for people and gave them money, it then also built dams in order to help protect the crops from the area around the Tennessee River Valley from flooding. And then it also was able to help provide electricity to the entire region. Several states that had very little electricity finally had electricity and were brought into the modern times. Finally, it also helped them gauge how much electricity should cost so that the government could better regulate and watch the electricity industry. So a lot of purposes are met with the TVA. For those of us living here in Tennessee, it still provides much of our electric energy across our region. Then you have the AAA, the second act to be found unconstitutional. But what it tried to do is provide benefits to farmers who are struggling. At first, what the first AAA did that was found unconstitutional, it actually encouraged them to provide less crops. So if you had lots of extra pigs or lots of extra milk or lots of extra grains, you're actually encouraged to get rid of those things and not put them in the market, because that would cause the price to drop and you would actually receive funds for this. And so after the slaughter of, say, 6 million pigs, that went to complete waste, the Supreme Court deemed that this was simply unconstitutional. So that's the second act of FDR's to be found unconstitutional. So luckily, FDR and the Congress swings around later on to provide better restrictions. In other words, what they would say is, here's how many acres you need to grow, no more than that. And if you do that, we will give you a subsidy to help you in taking care of the acres you are growing. That helped control the prices and also helped farmers stay out of massive debt. Next, we have the PWA. PWA is an administration that provides public works jobs. It provided jobs to many different groups. The biggest thing of it, though, is that it actually helped African Americans. It's one of the few programs so far in our nation's history, and in fact, I believe it's the first, that actually had a quota for hiring African Americans if you took a government contract. So if a company tried to build one of the public works projects, like a dam or a bridge, and they wouldn't hire African Americans, that contract would be taken from them and given to a company that would. So the PWA not only provides jobs, but it specifically provides help to African Americans. Then you have the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This act alone cost $12 billion and provided millions of jobs. So it provided jobs to a lot of different people, but one specific group it helped was through their Federal Number 1 Act or project, which helped artists. Now, you know, during hard times, people aren't really looking to pay for art or write songs or pay for music. And so because of that, the WPA provided jobs to those artists to do that for the government. Number 8, we have the Indian Reorganization Act, and it's probably pretty easy to guess who this helps. Native Americans under what others call the Indian New Deal, what they do is they roll back a lot of the issues brought upon them by the Dawes Act, which we talked about in a previous chapter, that had stripped them of many of their rights as Native American tribes, had subdivided them and sold off their extra land. So it rolls back a lot of those parts of the Dawes Act and even begins giving them some sovereignty. In other words, control over their own laws and being able to police themselves instead of being subject to both the federal government and state and local governments outside of their reservations. So Indians finally received some positive treatment under FDR. Number 9 is the Wagner Act. Wagner Act, its purpose was to provide protections to workers and their unions. Not only did it protect unions' rights to organize, but the biggest thing they get is the right to collectively bargain or strike a deal with their employer. Say for Maury County Education Association members, which is the teachers union here in Maury County, because we have over 50% of our teachers in the union, we are actually able to negotiate our salaries, our benefits, how many days off we get under the Tennessee state laws and what days those are. We're able to negotiate our calendar as a whole. So because of the Wagner Act, even today, unions like my teacher union are impacted by the Wagner Act. Next, you have the Securities and Exchange Act, which creates the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission. What the SEC does is it watches over the stock market. Remember, what helped lead to the crash in the 1920s was malpractice in the stock market, where companies would lie about the actual value of their company, and that would get people to continue investing in them despite the fact that their stock was worth way less because their business is actually losing money. What the SEC does is it investigates the profit margins and the profit reports and overall of the business that large companies have on the stock exchange. And if they lie about their profits, they are called out on it, they're fined, and people inside that organization can be put in jail. So people still seek to break the law, but the SEC is a watchdog trying to stop the excess that occurred in the 1920s. And then number 11, we have the Fair Labor Standards Act. You as teenagers definitely benefit from this because there is a minimum wage established. There's also no child labor law, which maybe you wanted to start working when you were 13 years old, but this cuts off any child labor below the age of 16. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, by setting those things and also a maximum working hour per week, it helps protect us workers from being abused by our employers. So again, the Wagner Act and Fair Labor Standards Act are two significant acts that are still in action today and protect workers from the abuses of their employers. And then you have the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act was meant to encourage, well, it does actually a lot of things beyond just dealing with elderly. It also provides insurance or aid for those who are disabled or hurt. But the biggest thing we know it for is to encourage elderly people or those who are older in the workplace to retire. So once you reach a certain age, you're able to retire and receive a pension from the government. And what that does is get you to retire so that jobs can open up for younger people. So in the Great Depression, what we see that mean is young people who could not find jobs anywhere suddenly have jobs open up, while the older people who give up their jobs are still receiving payment. So although some people don't like the idea of socialism and money coming out of your paycheck every single year against your will, the idea is that it encourages people to be able to live the rest of their life without having to work till the day they die, while also opening up new jobs. Then number 6, what actions or events? What I added onto this, you may notice it's not on the actual 32 key questions that I handed out this year in 2020 and 2021. But I add this on because I think it is important, and that's what actions or events during his presidency hindered the legacy of FDR and his New Deal. First is the court packing plan. Because the NRA and AAA are both deemed unconstitutional, FDR claims that the Supreme Court is simply too elderly to keep up with the times and the necessity of the tough times the nation is facing. Because of this, he says he needs to place as many as he can for every justice that is above the age of 70, which actually would have been 6 additional justices. Because of world events and because this was a power grab, Congress on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, see this as almost like a dictator type move, and it is soundly rejected by everyone in Congress, and FDR pulls back from his court packing plan. So this does hurt his legacy, and if you look at the voting record of Congress before and after this plan, you'll see that many of his acts are not swiftly passed or passed at all for the rest of his presidency, especially as World War II is looming just ahead. And speaking of the World War II, many people claim that the New Deal solved the crisis of the Great Depression. Well, that's simply not true at all, because what we see in 1937, there is a recession that shows that despite all of the jobs and all of the growth created from some of these New Deal programs, we enter into a second economic downturn in 1937, right after his first presidency. And so, because of this, many people look at the New Deal and say it did not solve the crisis. So what actually does solve it is World War II and the massive amount of production created by it. So what actions or events during his presidency hinder his legacy? That's the court packing plan and the recession of 1937. This has been chapter 32. There's a lot in this chapter, a lot of named events and items and people. But regardless, it is a really big turning point in our nation's history as we go from a laissez-faire government into much more of an interventionist and social welfare type government, especially when it comes to times of crisis. Thank you. Hope it answered all of your questions. Feel free to reach out to me if it did not. Have a good one.